This is an extra video on how you calculate the x and y values, how you go back and forth. So we have learned that to go from the x values to the y values, you're usually given the amount in the x column. So for example, grams of fish is 1,000 grams of fish, and then you're asked to calculate the number of calories. So the number of calories is 1.5 times. The number of calories is 1.5 times the number of grams that you're given as far as the amount of the fish. So you make that calculation, and that's the y value. But what if you're given the amount in the y column and you're asked to calculate how much there is in the x column if you only know the constant of proportionality, which in this case is 1.5 or 1 5/10? Well, what you have to do is, if you multiply by the constant of proportionality, 1 5/10, to go from x to y, then you divide by the constant of proportionality to go from y to x. To go backwards, you use the inverse operation, which in this case is division. So if you know that 2001 is equal to 1.5 times some number, then to figure out what that number is, you divide by 1.5. And that is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal of the constant of proportionality. I'm going to go into that in some detail in a moment. But the reciprocal is just 1 over the constant of proportionality. That is the reciprocal of the constant of proportionality. So multiplying by the reciprocal is the same as dividing by 1 5/10. You can kind of see that right here. 2001 divided by that 1 5/10 equals x, which equals 1,334 grams of fish. So remember, as we go through this, that the reciprocal of the constant of proportionality is 1 over the constant of proportionality, 1 over that amount. And so if the constant of proportionality is 1 5/10, which by the way is the same as 3/2, and what we're going to see is that the reciprocal of 3/2 is 2/3. It's 1 over 3/2, which actually works out to be 2/3. And I'm going to show that to you visually. So y is equal to 1.5 times the value of x. And so y is also equal to 3/2. 1 5/10 is the same as 3/2. So y is equal to 3/2 of x. So that's right here. Y is equal to 1 5/10 x. So y is equal to 3/2 x. And this is just setting it up for you. So if you multiply x by 3/2 to get to y, so in this case to get to 2001, to go in the opposite direction to calculate x given y, so now you're given the number of calories, you divide by 3/2. You use the inverse operation, and you just go backwards. So you divide by that same number by 3/2. This is going to get a little bit confusing as we go through this, and this is why people have trouble understanding it. Because you're going to start throwing around terms and flipping numbers over using reciprocals. You just have to slowly go through it to try to keep it straight. So I'm going to just use simple numbers and show you how this works. So 6 times 3/2 equals 9. So what does that mean? So 3/2 of 6. I'm going to take 6, I'm going to divide it by 2. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 is 1/2 of 6. Well, this problem says, what's 3/2 of 6? Well, 1/2 of 6 is 3. 2/2 of 6 is 6. So that's 3, and 2 times 3 is 6. And 3/2 of 6 is 3 times that 3. It's 3 times 1/2, which is 3/2, which is equal to 9. So 3/2 of 6. Now you can look at this as 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 times 3 is 9. Or you can look at it as 6 times 3 is 18. 18 divided by 2 is 9. You should practice looking at it both ways. And this is going to take some effort. This is going to take some work to go through these and to understand how this is working. So 6 times 3/2 equals 9. So that means I can take that 9 and I can divide it by that same 3/2. So 9 divided by 3 halves is equal to 6. Well, what does that mean? So 9 divided by 3 halves. That means I'm going to divide 9 by 3. So 9 divided by 3. So I'm going to divide 9 into 3 equal parts. 3, 6, 9. And this half down here means I'm going to take 2 of those parts. 3 and 6. So 2 times 3 is 2 of those parts. And this is easier seen as, well, actually, let me just remind you that you're dividing by the inverse operation. So division is the inverse operation. So 6 times 3 halves equals 9. So now if I use the inverse operation, 9 divided by that same 3 halves, that's going to equal 6. Well, that is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. Now, the reciprocal of 3 halves is 2/3. And that's known as the multiplicative inverse. And so we're going to multiply by the multiplicative inverse. And remember that multiplication is the inverse operation. So we're going to use the inverse operation, and we're going to use the multiplicative inverse. It wouldn't make any sense to multiply by 3 halves. That's going to get you a number larger than 9, because 3 halves is larger than 1. What makes sense is if I'm going to use the inverse operation, then I'm going to use the multiplicative inverse. 2/3 of 9 equals 6. Now notice I'm using the commutative property to switch the order, because it's easier for me to show you conceptually with a drawing what 2/3 of 9 is than what 9 times 2/3 is. I can show you that, but it makes more sense if I show it to you as 2/3 of 9. So what's 2/3 of 9 mean? We take the 9 divided by 3. Take that 9 divided by 3. You're going to get this drawing up here. 9 divided by 3 is 369. And then you take 2 of those 3's. 2 times 3 is 6 right here. So notice that 2/3 of 9 is the 6, and 3 halves of 6 up here is the 9. So you should spend time going back and forth and seeing how these drawings are the opposite of each other. One's going one way, 6 times 3 halves equals 9. The other one is going the opposite way. 2/3 of this 9 is equal to that 6. So 2/3, 2 times these 3's equals 6. And notice it's the same drawing. And this 2/3 is the reciprocal of 3 halves, and that's also called the multiplicative inverse. I'm going to show that to you in a moment. This is hard, and you should have in earlier grades gotten lots of practice doing this, but it is hard to keep straight. It takes lots of practice for it to begin to really truly make sense. Let's try to write this again a little bit more simply. So x times 3 halves. Now 3 halves in this case is the constant of proportionality. So some value x times the constant of proportionality equals 2001. So 3 halves means whatever x is, you divide x by 2, so you divide it into 2 parts, and you take 3 of those 2 parts, and that equals 2001. And that helps you actually figure out what x really is, because 2001 divided by 3 halves is equal to x. Well, dividing by 3 halves, take 2001 divided by 3, and take 2 of those parts. That gets you back to x. That's easier seen. First of all, let me remind you that 2001 divided by 3 halves will get you back to the value of x, which is 1,334. So if I multiply by 3 halves to get to 2001, I'm going to divide by 3 halves to get back to x, which is 1,334. But actually, how do you divide by 3 halves? Operationally, what you actually do to calculate that is, and actually, I'm sorry, let me just insert once again, let me remind you that 3 halves is the same as 1 5/10. So if you use decimals, in this case, a little bit easier to use decimals, although I always advise students to use fractions, because it is fractions that you are going to use throughout your math careers as you go on. Decimals show up, but fractions are a lot easier to operate with. It may not seem that way, but in the long run it is. So 2001 divided by 1 5/10 gets you back to 1,334. All right, so that's the same as 2/3 of 2001. So 2001 divided by 3/2 is the same as, I'm going to use the inverse operation. I'm going to multiply by the multiplicative inverse, which is 2/3. So you just take the 3/2 and you flip the fraction over to write it as 2/3. That is the inverse of 3/2. So you multiply by the inverse. So you take 2001, divide it into 3 equal parts, and you take 2 of those parts. That gets you to 1,334. So take 2001, divide it into 3 equal parts, which is 667, and take 2 of those parts. That gets you to 1,334. So 2/3 of 2001. Notice once again that this is the inverse operation. Up here, 2001 divided by 3/2 is the same as 2001 times 2/3. Use the inverse operation and use the multiplicative inverse of 3/2, which is 2/3. That's also known as the reciprocal. So this all seems like a lot if you haven't thought about it enough. And I'm going to give you some problems to practice on. If you work at it, it will begin to make sense. All right, so 2001 divided by 3/2 is the same as 2001 times, so remember it's the inverse operation times the multiplicative inverse, known as the reciprocal. Again, it wouldn't make any sense to multiply by 3/2. It only makes sense to multiply by the multiplicative inverse, using inverse operation, using multiplicative inverse, or the reciprocal, to get back to x. So again, visually, it's 2001 divided by 3, and which was 667. It's 2 of those 667s, which gets you to 1,334. All right, so here's 3 problems to practice on. And you should practice using this drawing. So I'll come back to this in just a second. But if you're given a constant of proportionality as 7/5, 15 times that constant of proportionality times 7/5 equals y, whatever y calculates to be. And then convince yourself by drawing that y times the reciprocal. So you can multiply by the reciprocal to get back to 15. That's the same as dividing by 7/5. So that's saying y divided by 7/5 will get you back to 15, but you're going to actually multiply by the reciprocal. So y times the reciprocal, 5/7 gets you to the 15. So you should make this kind of drawing. So this is the constant of proportionality in this case, times 6 equals 9. So make that drawing that goes with this problem. And then to go backwards, 9 times the reciprocal, it's going to get you back to the 6. So make this drawing to get you back to the 6. So you have to practice going back and forth. So convince yourselves that 12 times 5/4 equals some value. You calculate that. Then take that value and multiply it by 4/5. That equals 12. So just imagine dividing draw a rectangle, divide it up into 4 equal parts, but then it's 5 of those 4. So you're going to go 1 extra 4th over, and now visualize those 5 parts, and this 12 is going to be 4 out of those 5 parts. So you have to keep going back and forth between the drawing and the problem. The last one, 8 times 9/4 equals y. Whatever y calculates out to be, multiply that by the reciprocal. That better take you back to the 8. And you should just once again practice making this kind of drawing. If you do that, you'll start to understand. This is the work that you have to do to understand the math.